All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here with Ivan the Heathen again, who has a very high quality YouTube channel, undersubscribed. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Talks on a various number of issues relating to intellectual history, some contemporary political commentary. Always happy to see an Ivan the Heathen upload. So I hope you do subscribe. But we discussed the prehistory of liberalism in our last discussion. I'd recommend checking that out before you watch this video. This time, we're going to pick up with the influence of John Locke. We have now liberalism as a concrete ideology established. And John Locke obviously has a massive influence on the Anglosphere. He's influential on the founding fathers of the United States, influential in English conceptions of rights, laws, etc. But he also has a more wide-ranging influence. I know that Schopenhauer was a fan of Locke, not for his politics, but for his epistemology. So Ivan is the topic expert on this for the purpose of our discussion today. So I'll mainly be following him and asking questions about the history of liberalism. And my first question to Ivan is, what happens with the philosophy of John Locke on the continent? How does this spread into France, Spain, Italy? What influence does Locke have on continental thinkers?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on again. This is going to be fun. Now, as far as Locke, well, in addition to his sort of direct influence, there's also the general context of mercantilism as a kind of politico-economic system operating both in France and in Italy. And although, I'm sorry, both in France and in England, in Italy to a lesser extent. I'll go into that in a moment. But although the structure of the mercantilist systems in England and France are similar, the French situation is interesting because all of the laws, the restrictions, the monopoly privileges, the the import and export bans and controls, and every other sort of economic regulation you can imagine, all of these things are much more stringently enforced in France. And so as a result, you get a very early upsurge of economic liberalism, of sort of laissez-faire thinking in France. And this should be kind of obvious because the term laissez-faire itself is a French expression. Um, Really, you could go all the way back to the reign of Louis XIV, and this is really because the mercantilist system in France at that point sort of reaches its apex. I mean, the French state by then is handing out benefices and monopoly privileges to corporations left and right. This group of merchants can only sell wool here. That group of merchants can only this group of merchants can import or export that product. Bans on certain types of cloth, et cetera, et cetera. It gets actually quite extreme. At one point in France, the government issues a total ban on calico because wool manufacturers faced competition from it and didn't like the competition because they were being outcompeted. And it got so bad that Cardinal Richelieu and then later Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis' kind of finance minister, created an entire network of spies to run around the country and just sort of, watch people and see if they'd imported any of these fabrics. And you'd get all these weird stories like, oh, the Marquis of so-and-so has a governess at his home and she was seen wearing a calico dress. And it was like that. And people would be fined and arrested. And it got to that point. So living under this system obviously, made many people unhappy. There were peasant rebellions, the most famous of which is probably the Fronde, which was sort of led by clerics, or at least clerics provided the kind of intellectual foundations for it. There were these kind of agricultural rebellions. Another example would be the Croquant Rebellion, which was basically a bunch of farmers who were being taxed to the hilt and began complaining because the taxes were so high that they could not only couldn't they pay them monetarily, but then when the government came and began confiscating their produce or their livestock to pay in kind, that obviously immiserated them even further. In some cases, even their farm implements were confiscated, and people eventually just snapped and rebelled. So this whole thing was going on, and this is right around the time that Locke was writing. So Locke's ideas were just kind of part of a general context and general diffusion of ideas. You started to have, for example, um, people like the Archbishop Claude Fleury was a priest, but obviously saw the problems with this kind of mercantilist arrangement, and he wanted to sort of insinuate himself into the corridors of power and whisper into the ears of the right powerful people and get them to loosen all of these economic restrictions. And he formed a group of people around him to do that. There were others like Baleba, or what was it, Pierre de Bois-Guilbert, another important thinker in this regard, who actually may have been the first totally laissez-faire writer, as far as I know. He had written in, I believe it was 1691, a discourse on trade, and basically said that the economy and society in general operates according to a natural system, and that if the government intervenes in it or attempts to control it, that this will stifle its effects and create unintended consequences. The general laissez-faire position as early as 1691. And these people were influenced by Locke. They were aware of his natural rights work. They were also aware of some of his writings on economics. Locke was mainly commissioned by his mentor, Lord Shaftesbury, to write a few anti-mercantilist tracts, a few tracts against usury laws and so forth, where he would say things like, that interest actually has a function, that its level is a result of the supply of money, for example, so that the more plentiful money is, the more of it there is to lend, the lower interest rates are, and vice versa. This happened with Locke because at the time there was a controversy going on in England about whether to have the government forcibly lower the interest rate. Also, not long before then, the Bank of England had been established mainly as a way to make it easier for the government to finance its debts. And wage wars and so forth, which was especially a useful instrument to Charles II and his successors, because during Charles II's reign, and a little bit later as well, the government would normally take loans out from gold merchants, but eventually would get itself into financial trouble and be unable to repay the loans. So, essentially destroying its own credit. And then you had, sort of people come up with the idea of like, well, why don't we just get a government chartered bank that can issue banknotes, and also will prohibit other banks from competing with the Bank of England and so forth. So they set up that sort of system. But yeah, there was a controversy around the same time about the rate of interest, and certain mercantilist writers had observed that in Holland, the rate of interest was very low, and the Dutch were extremely prosperous. So they drew the connection that, well, a low rate of interest must make you prosperous. And Locke pointed out correctly that a low rate of interest is not a cause of prosperity, it's a result of prosperity. Once you are prosperous, once money is abundant, once capital is abundant, then as a result, the rate of interest falls, and you can't sort of manufacture this. So you had Locke's natural rights work, his work in political philosophy, and then also these economic writings filtered down to these French writers that I mentioned, like Bois-Guilbert especially. But in the French case, the focus was on trying to get into the ear of the king, to get him to loosen mercantilist restrictions. That was basically the how it went for the 17th century. As you enter into the 18th century, economics begins developing more. You get more and more writers on economic theory. Of course, everyone thinks of Adam Smith as sort of the founder of economics, that the field more or less came into existence fully formed out of his own head. This is not true. I did mention the last time I was on with you about Richard Cannelon, the great Irish-French economist and theorist who predated Smith by a few decades, and who also wrote in French. So by that token, he kind of falls into the French tradition. In addition to Candillon, there was also Turgot, and Robert Turgot, who during the kind of just before the French Revolution, really, what was it, 1774, as I remember, he became finance minister of France. And he also held a total laissez-faire position. Many people associate him with the physiocratic movement, which I'll discuss in a minute. He wasn't really a physiocrat, though, kind of a fellow traveler, but not really. The interesting thing about Turgot, though, is that he wrote an enormous amount about all kinds of things. And his economic writings are pretty short. He didn't write all that much about it, but what he did write was fantastically original. And his most original insight basically is that he figured out, more or less figured out Austrian capital theory, and realized that the rate of interest was a function of time preference. That is, the differential valuation that people place on present goods as against future goods. And he also kind of casually dropped the law of diminishing returns into one of his essays. So a pretty astonishing, pretty amazing, pretty original economic theorist. But the physiocrats, who were roughly contemporaneous with him, they're kind of an interesting group in that personally they kind of took on the attributes of this bizarre cult because their founder, Dr. Quesnay, was elevated to the status of this, almost demigod-like figure. The other physiocrats would write these long encomiums to him, comparing him to Socrates and how wonderful he is, and the tableau économique, which is this really bizarre, complicated kind of flowchart thing, which purported to show the operations of the economy and how specie moves and so forth. The Marquis de Mirabeau, his most influential follower, Quesnay's most influential follower, basically said something like, that this is one of the three greatest advances in the intellectual history of mankind. Some really exaggerated thing like that. But all in all, the physiocrats, they were very good from a policy perspective. Basically, had the laissez-faire position, advocated that the king reduce mercantilist restrictions on trade and so forth. But their technical economics were very odd, mainly because they regarded agriculture as the only ultimately profitable industry. And so then came to view every other industry and every other field as sort of parasitic upon agriculture. And the reason they had this view was that, they thought agriculture was the only thing that produced additional matter. If you grow wheat or something, you get wheat that you didn't have before, that appears from the land, and there it is, and it wasn't there before. But if you work in, I don't know, metallurgy or some other form of industry, you're really just moving matter around. And so to them, this was not really productive. So they had these kind of economic views. They were also opposed to, they were in favor of usury laws, which is one major difference between them and Turgot. But like I said, they had an influence on Turgot, and they basically had a natural rights kind of framework where they favored property rights in a sort of Lockean way. That's more or less Locke's immediate influence as we head out from the 17th century and into the 18th. There are a few other lesser writers like the Abbé de Condillac, who published an economic treatise a month before The Wealth of Nations came out and was much better, at least from a free market perspective, than The Wealth of Nations. But that's more or less kind of a general overview of Locke's influence on France specifically. In Italy, the major economists to mention, pre-Smithian, would be Fernandino Galiani, who wrote a treatise on money, and basically took the old insights that the Spanish scholastics from the 16th century had about monetary theory. And just very quickly, what the scholastics did basically was, first, they were able to explain monetary dynamics and the general pricing of goods on the market according to the same theory. Most medieval writers, most of the original scholastics, thought that you needed two separate theories for this, and the Spanish scholastics realized that this was not the case, that you could explain the value of both money and goods in terms of the jostling of supply and demand. they also became interested in the phenomenon of inflation, because Spain had been importing tremendous amounts of gold and silver from the New World, and they noticed prices rising. And now the usual explanation given during the Middle Ages to price increases was coin clipping and, devaluation and debasement of the coinage. But this wasn't going on at the time in the sort of mid 16th century in Spain. So they said, well, it must be the importation of additional species. And then that prompted this whole supply and demand analysis that I mentioned. So Galliani basically took that from the Spanish scholastics, applied that to his monetary theory, and then described how, money emerges because initially it's a commodity on the market which is found to be saleable, and because it's so saleable and because it trades so easily and there's significant demand for it, people realize that is useful as an intermediary to, kind of intermediate barter exchanges, because normally barter is difficult. If you're trying to barter one good for another, you need to find someone who has what you want and also who needs what you have. But if you use money as an intermediary, that this solves the problem. It's basically the Austrian analysis of money, but you have this Italian guy who'd come up with it before Adam Smith. So basically, yeah, that's the gist of it from both a political and an economic standpoint. Locke's influence on the continent. Yeah, that pretty much covers more or less the 17th and the 18th centuries, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple questions, just clarifying, and then I want to ask about Germany. So the physiocrats, in a way, they're sort of a precursor to a resource-based economy view. Would you say that their theory of value was essentially that land is value then? I remember an anecdote about some province in France trying to issue a land-based currency on the basis of this physiocratic theory of value, and which resulted obviously in a liquidity crisis and some kind of economic collapse. I'm not sure if you know about that incident in particular, or if I'm misremembering that. But is this their theory of value, basically, that land is value?
Yeah, the land is value, and therefore all value comes from agriculture, and all other industries are sort of parasitic upon the agricultural industry. There's some economic historians who kind of take the view that they're sort of apologists for the farming class. I don't really look at it this way because, well, for one thing, the tax policy that they advocated kind of destroys that interpretation utterly, because they thought that, well, the king should just levy a single direct tax upon land, because if he taxed anything else, that would just amount to an indirect tax on land, because every other thing that has value ultimately derives its value from land. And so if you tax anything other than land, you are ultimately in effect taxing land. So, if you're going to say that the physiocrats were, shilling for farmers and landowners, it's kind of a bizarre way of shilling for somebody to tell the king that the people you're allegedly shilling for should be the only ones who are taxed. But yeah, basically they saw land as value, and that all value derived from land and from agricultural produce. Yeah.
See, there's something I'm sympathetic to that view in some way. Not that agriculture is the only productive industry. I mean, under this view, mining should also be productive as well. But I mean, directly or indirectly, all value ultimately does come from the land. I mean, we ourselves come from the land. So I think there's something in that view that has to be considered, as opposed to subjective theories of value, which seem like there's no clear link to the limitation of finite natural resources in most subjective theories of value. So I don't know if would you say that there's anything that you would consider valuable in that approach that the physiocrats took, and are you aware of any? I know the Venus Project, back with the Zeitgeist documentary, the people who made that were behind this resource-based economy stuff. They're probably still kicking around somewhere on the internet. But are there any serious economic theorists who are still interested in that basic view? This is kind of a tangent from liberalism, but
Well, there's Henry George and his followers. I mean, he had more or less a similar view to the physiocrats, a much more like totally free market position. But basically, yeah, that George's view was that land really is a common resource, or should be, And so it should be kind of as widely distributed as possible. But then within that framework and within also that land tax proposal, which he favored, within that context, beyond that, he favored just a total free market approach. But yes, Henry George would be the person to come to mind, and his followers. And he had quite a few of those in America. You could also sort of tie George's views to Adam Smith, because there is a connection between the physiocratic view that land is value and then Smith's idea of the labor theory of value. I mean, ultimately, if you take the labor theory of value seriously and then apply that to capital theory, there are only two ways you can go. You can either end up as a Georgist or you can end up as a Marxist. And I guess we'll get to that later. But Marxists do actually claim Adam Smith correctly, I would say, as one of their precursors. So yeah, Henry George definitely would be one person.
Okay. So another question clarifying the situation in France. To my mind, I would expect that the moves towards centralization in the late 1600s would be the impetus towards these kind of increasing mercantile restrictions. I mean, under the manorial system, obviously, in the guild system in the medieval period, there wasn't exactly a free market economy, but there was a certain degree of, market operation between different provinces where people could vote with their feet, which we mentioned before, having to do with this kind of market for sovereignty in the Viking Age. With the push towards centralization in France, is it basically a function of kind of this central planning and central monopoly on policy that led to the ability for tighter mercantile controls, in the same way that some socialist countries in Latin America on paper are extremely coercive and controlling of economic activity, but in practice nothing is really enforced, and they're actually more free market in some ways than the United States, which on paper is much more free market. So is it that we went from on paper, a more mercantile system, but then with centralization, it became kind of a reality? And then I would tie that question in with my question about Germany. What's going on with Germany at this point? I know that the manorial system lasts longer in Germany. Do we not have this same push against mercantilism in Germany precisely because Germany remained more fractured and peasants did have this kind of market for different providers of economic policy in different provinces?
Oh, okay. So about France, there are a couple of things that go into that. For the century or so, or even more, before Louis XIV, there's this gradual rise in absolutist thinking and absolutist thought, and then you further have the context of the Protestant Reformation and the effect of the Huguenots on all that, and Henry IV's accession to the throne, who was, nominally at first a Huguenot and then became a Catholic in order to become king. But Henry IV and then his successors began surrounding themselves with these, absolutist theorists, Jean Baudin and his followers and so forth. And their view was basically that the king is God's representative on earth. The more extreme variants of this view, which Baudin himself didn't quite hold, but some of his followers, Pierre Gregoire, for example, definitely did, who basically said the king can do no wrong by definition. If the king rules badly, this is divine chastisement. If he rules well, it's divine reward. And the king's will is just what it is, and all those beneath him must obey. So there was that kind of general context of just the king as this absolute ruler, which, naturally favored centralization of power. And in any situation where you have a centralization of power, you're going to have a congeries of economic and political interests swirling around the king, looking to get their pound of flesh, their share of the loot from the whole deal. And eventually it would build and build and build. Now, as I mentioned, in France, they were especially serious about enforcing these restrictions. the spy networks that Richelieu and Colbert set up. You did have a similar kind of mercantilist system in England, as I mentioned, but they weren't as serious about enforcing everything. And it's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate, because assuming that the restrictions had been looser in France, or if they hadn't been as tightly enforced in France as they were in England, might France have turned out to become the center of the Industrial Revolution in Europe instead of England? I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to wonder about. So yeah, definitely it was because there was stronger enforcement in France. So they actually enforced the rules on the books. Now, as far as Germany, I do know that there were a few German princes and a few German dukes and so forth who kind of fell under the sway of physiocracy and attempted to implement some of those ideas, and did to the extent that they fell under that influence, kind of implement a free market approach. But the general decentralization of Germany, the fact that it was fractured and scattered, made this easier to do because of the political decentralization. I mean, yeah, you basically have the right idea that Germany was not at that time a centralized state in the way that France was. And so this wasn't quite as major a concern in Germany as it was in France at the time.
So yeah, ironically, a greater absolutism acted as a kind of springboard for an accelerated liberalism in France. So on that note, then, I guess the run up to the French Revolution is an interesting period. There are those economic thinkers you mentioned. There's also Rousseau and Voltaire, who have a big impact on culture in the run up to the French Revolution. Rousseau, you would not consider a liberal from our last discussion. Would you consider Voltaire a liberal?
I guess. I mean, his contributions to political thought, at least his original contributions, are basically nil. He was, a popularizer and a wit and a fun guy. But as far as someone important in the history of, the evolution of thought, I wouldn't assign a prominent role to him. He was more of a popularizer than anything. But yeah, I mean, sort of generally speaking. It's actually funny. When Voltaire and Rousseau became acquainted, they hated each other immediately. Rousseau sent Voltaire a copy of what was it? His discourse on involuntary servitude, and Voltaire, being Voltaire, writes back in his kind of snarky way and says, "I have received, sir, your discourse against the human race, in which you explain why we are all apes and why we must all be sent back to the jungle forthwith. Thank you very much." It was, quite enlightening. Something sarcastic like that. Yeah, they hated each other immediately. But yeah, I mean, Voltaire was kind of in that general sort of Paris salon culture, and liberalism was in the air then. So yes, even though he's not a major thinker, yeah, sure.
Right. And the major English wit who was contemporary was David Hume. Um, what I'm not really sure all that much about David Hume's political opinions. Would you say he basically falls under liberalism? I know his atheistic tendencies suggest Enlightenment thought generally, but is there anything specifically political in Hume that comes to mind?
Well, in terms of the actual political conclusions that he reached, yes, I would put him in that tradition broadly. He was not a natural rights theorist, at least not in any standard way. And he also rejected social contract theories of the state. Basically, his view was that private property emerged as an institution because people perceived that the establishment of property rules would be mutually beneficial to all of them, and so it kind of emerged spontaneously. And the state for Hume also emerged spontaneously in that same way, without any kind of explicit contract. I mean, Hume was quite happy to grant that in the earliest days of their origins, states were founded in great crimes and conquests and all these kind of things. He didn't hide that, but he said that basically with time and with the fact that people wanted their property defended, they just kind of fell into an inertia where they began to obey the state, and so the state kind of grandfathered legitimacy onto itself. So Hume's basic temperament was very conservative in that way. He was strongly opposed to revolutions or to anything that would upend the existing social order. So he was not keen really to promote the idea that it would be legitimate to rebel against a state which wasn't, protecting property, or which was, doing various things that it probably shouldn't be doing. But still, broadly speaking, he held, kind of free market views. He did believe in these kind of general liberal principles of, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and he had a general favorable attitude toward limited government and so forth. So I would place him in the liberal tradition broadly, but he wasn't like a natural rights thinker or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now looking over towards the colonies at this point, there is Thomas Paine, who popularizes some liberal thinking. John Locke is obviously influential. I did try to read Common Sense at one point, and it was insufferable to me. I have sympathies with monarchism, and I thought that most of the arguments were just patently sophistical that Paine offered. It's kind of surprising that he was as effective as he was, although I suppose the general public was not really educated compared to that in England or France at the time. So I guess it was enough for his audience. But are there any other thinkers that were highly influential on the founding fathers, the run up to the American Revolution?
Well, on the founding fathers, I was going to say Jefferson himself, who was obviously immersed in that tradition. I mean, you can also look at a few earlier precursors. People like Roger Williams, who founded the Rhode Island colony and who was in regular contact with the Levelers, by the way. You could sort of see him as this kind of proto-libertarian with some early influence and kind of that strain of thought on the American colonies. Then there was Anne Hutchinson, who was one of his followers and was more radical than he was. You can also look to the brief period in Pennsylvania, about a 25 or 30-year period during the 1600s, where functionally there was anarchism in Pennsylvania. Basically, William Penn, the founder of the colony, had sent, a governor to Pennsylvania, and the people just collectively ignored him. Basically, didn't feel like paying their taxes, didn't feel like playing along with any of that, and the whole thing kind of just fell into disrepair, and people just lived without it for a few decades.
Well, the Quaker government were pacifist, so it's hard to enforce the law when you can't use violence.
Well, yeah. I mean, that also went into it. And yeah, they just kind of generally refused to comply. And so there's William Penn, sitting in England, and he's like, wait a minute, why aren't any revenues coming in from my colony? And so he finally learns of what's going on and attempts to send another governor to Pennsylvania to sort of crack down on everything. And this governor announces beforehand that he's going to be showing up there, and he expects, to be greeted with great fanfare and so forth. But he arrives in Pennsylvania, and there's no one there to greet him. He just kind of shows up by himself, and he's like, well, where is everybody? And then he walks around for a bit, and a few little boys show up and start pelting him with pebbles. One of the great libertarian moments of early American history. But yeah, that was eventually, eventually Penn cracked down on these people and governmental authority was restored. But there are little, pockets of things like that during the colonial period that you could look to.
Yeah, and the Appalachian settlers in general continued to live in effective anarchy until, well into the 19th century.
Yeah. I mean,
itself in America was naturally a libertarian force.
Yeah, the actual layout of the country. You have this enormous, wild, untamed wilderness where government can't reach. And also the fact that the colonies often secured extremely liberal charters from the king, because the king was just eager to get rid of these people. Like, yeah, sure, go across the sea, leave us alone, form your colony, I won't tax you, whatever. And, as a result of that, there was a long period of about 150 years, which was later called salutary neglect, where the colonies were more or less left on their own, hardly taxed at all. And they, became used to that state of affairs. And so when the crown began hiking up taxes for various reasons, this angered people and eventually stoked the flames of what would become the American Revolution.
Right. Now, there are really, two American revolutions in quick succession. The first produces the Articles of Confederation. The second produces the actual U.S. Constitution. The second is much more influenced by Hamilton's faction, Federalists, centralizing principles. The first iteration of the revolution was really kind of an alliance between different colonial cultures that wanted to maintain their own way of life and their own interests. They had different concepts of freedom in the first place. There's a kind of retconning of, I guess, Lockean Enlightenment Masonic values onto the American populace as a whole, but there were really several distinct cultures. The best books on this that I'm aware of are Albion's Seed, which breaks it down into 4 major colonial cultures from different parts of England. Another book is, I think, American Nations. The guy's name might be Colin Woodward or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
David Hackett Fisher is the author of Albion's Seed. Both of those books were pretty good. The end of American Nations, I would not recommend. It gets a little bit political and in a way that I disagree with, but the majority of that book is quite good. So there were other kind of non-ideological power politics, jostling for control of the federal government, but also just a desire to retain their own authentic traditions, which were largely embedded in different varieties of Protestantism. You had Puritans, Anglicans in the Tidewater South, and then Appalachian Presbyterians, basically just looking for maximum individual freedom, which is maybe the truest libertarian force in throughout American history, although ironically also the biggest pro-war force in American history. I think the Appalachian Scots-Irish descended people have supported every foreign conflict this country has been through. But go back to that issue of the kind of second American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Would you say there are different intellectual traditions? I mean, obviously you can go to like the Federalist Papers and the debates that were going on. What intellectuals would be on the two? Jefferson was more on the side of the Articles of Confederation. Obviously, Hamilton was more on the side of the Federalists. I mean, what other, I guess, major intellectual figures behind these two sides, and why do you think the centralizing forces ultimately went out?
I mean, I think you can explain the coup that was the Constitution by just simple desire for power. The original state in the United States was established under the Articles of Confederation. And remember, under the Articles of Confederation, you can't tax anyone without a unanimous vote, number one, which was already extremely inconvenient to those who wanted power. And the Constitution sort of replaced that with a majority vote. I think you can basically explain that transition through simple power politics. You don't really even need to get into any kind of highfalutin theory, and any theory insofar as it came, really just came after the fact as a kind of justification for what had already happened.
Right.
I mean, Hamilton, obviously, if you know anything about his writings during the time, was constantly going on about how we needed a government with more energy, more energy, more energy. This was a constant refrain of his. Hamilton, more or less, in particular, wanted to establish some kind of aristocracy in the United States, and tried to cobble that together from, various merchants and stock jobbers and so forth. So yeah, and I mean, he for example initiated this whole scheme of buying up war bonds from Revolutionary War veterans, which had been seriously devalued because by the time Hamilton had decided to buy these things up, the government had already proven itself well and truly incapable of repaying them. So the bonds were massively devalued, and then Hamilton kind of says, oh, let's set up a Bank of the United States and redeem the bonds that way, at which point the value skyrockets, but all the value accrues to Hamilton's friends who went around, buying up the bonds at pennies on the dollar, and, essentially
The
just kind of, I'm
the
sorry, what were you
mainly
saying?
Scots-Irish soldiers who basically won the revolution were paid in war bonds and then were basically coerced into selling these war bonds to the central bank at a deep discount, and then were basically just deprived of all of their wages as soldiers, causing the
Yeah, more
whiskey rebellion, right?
more or less. Yeah, more or less. And then you mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion, which, and Shays Rebellion and things like that, which were tax revolts and were cracked down pretty ruthlessly. We could also mention Rhode Island, which initially refused to consent to have the Constitution ratified, and then it's like, ratify this voluntary contract or we'll invade you, because the contract is voluntary, don't you know? Um, yeah, so you could definitely describe what happened, with the Constitution as a coup and as a betrayal of the ostensible original principles of the American Revolution. But yeah, like I said, I don't think you need to turn to any kind of abstract philosophizing to justify that. Simple Machiavellian drives for power provide a good enough explanation of that.
Right. Okay, so I guess let's turn back to France. Are there any other theorists that you would mention in the lead up to the French Revolution, and anything else going on in the continent in general during the 18th century?
Well, if we're going to talk about the French Revolution, there's always the Nesta Webster theory about the Illuminati and the various kind of clubs similar to the Jacobin Club that were sort of conspiring behind the scenes to bring about the French Revolution. Um, it's actually quite interesting. There's a much later French writer, Pierre Gaxot, who wrote a history of the French Revolution in 1947. And this guy is interesting because he was associated with Charles Maurras and Action Française, which is this kind of French, reactionary, far right political organization. But his view of the French Revolution was basically that the aristocracy had, by that point, more or less been convinced to let go of mercantilism and was in the process of slowly relaxing these restrictions anyway. And so you probably could have achieved many of the, genuine liberal aims that the French revolutionaries ostensibly wanted, at least from an economic standpoint, without all of the bloodshed. And so that was almost totally, if not totally, unnecessary. But I mean, for the French Revolution, you also have to mention Rousseau, who, as I said, is not a liberal, but his influence was immense on the continent. So we should definitely talk about him. Now, Rousseau, in general, I mean, I think the best way to understand his political thought is that he's kind of a throwback to Plato. He's kind of a throwback to ancient political thinking. See, for him, freedom is the ability of a citizen to participate in the state and to chart his own political destiny, which is basically the ancient conception of political freedom. I mean, there's a couple of works of his where he kind of builds up on this theory. The discourse on inequality that he sent to on involuntary servitude that he sent to Voltaire, and that got that snarky reaction from him. Also starts out with this kind of general social contract theory, but unlike Locke and Pufendorf and most of the other social contract theorists, Rousseau didn't just postulate a pre-political man, which all of the social contract theorists more or less did. He postulated a pre-social man. So for Rousseau, there were basically three stages. You had this kind of primitive Eden where there was no private property and people lived in this kind of savage state. And then at some point, someone decided to fence off a plot of land and private property was created. And then social relations came into being and inequality emerged. And that was sort of the social state for Rousseau. And then out of that emerged the state as an institution, not only to safeguard property, but also to kind of enable the citizens, the people in the society, to sort of steer their political life. So, I mean, it's kind of weird because when he talks about the savage state, most people regard Rousseau as seeing, pre-social savages as these kind of, innocent creatures with no covetousness, with no greed, with no violent tendencies, and that's not exactly how Rousseau saw things. It's not that for him savages were morally good; it's that they were kind of amoral or premoral, like something that transcends morality. There is a kind of benevolence that Rousseau thought flowed out from the savage, but it was a spontaneous kind of benevolence, an unthinking benevolence. It wasn't like, you had before you the choice of choosing to do either right or wrong, and you made a deliberate decision to do one or the other. Um, it wasn't that thought out. It wasn't that planned. It was kind of instinctual. This is sort of how he conceived of savage life. But basically, after private property is established, and he saw agriculture really as kind of the great evil here that pulled us out of this Edenic state and led to the establishment of private property. Then you have, the state emerging. And he followed Hobbes, Rousseau did, insofar as he saw the state as something that the citizens totally surrendered all of their rights to, and just totally kind of gave themselves over to, and kind of surrendered all that they had to the collective, and yet somehow, in his telling, nevertheless retained total freedom. And it's not clear at all what he means by this, except to say that he was working with the ancient conception of freedom as the ability to influence politics. So basically, you get Rousseau's concept of the general will, which is very strange, and I don't claim to understand it because he's not clear about it at all. But it seems to me that what Rousseau is trying to get at with this concept of the general will, and as the state as sort of aiming to be the embodiment of the general will and to enact the general will, is something kind of similar to John Rawls's original position thought experiment. For those who don't know, basically this is how Rawls sets up his political order. He says, okay, imagine yourself outside of whatever particular social context you happen to occupy. If you're rich, remove that aspect of your identity from yourself. If you're highly intelligent, remove that aspect of your identity from yourself. If you're average intelligence, if you're of low intelligence, whatever it is, remove all these kind of particular qualities of yourself, and imagine that you don't know what your social position will be like in the society that everyone has come together to agree to establish. Given that you don't know what any of these particular facts will be, what sort of society would you like to exist? And that seems like what Rousseau more or less is getting at with the general will, because he talks about the general will as not being the will of all, not being the simple will of the majority, but as what the people would will if they were sort of purely rational and not motivated by selfish concerns. And if they did not have, any particular interests that they thought of and wanted to advance, and just kind of examine things in this sort of pure way. Um, I don't know. I mean, that seems like what he's getting at, but the ultimate upshot of it, of course, is that he claims the citizen to be totally free, and yet the citizen gives up everything he has, and you effectively have a kind of total state, which is what you eventually did see in the French Revolution. I mean, you had this
Right.
complete, terror state that, guillotined people at the slightest provocation, sometimes just to satisfy bloodlust, frankly. So there's definitely Rousseau's influence on the French Revolution. I would not call him
So,
a liberal, but yeah.
yeah, he anticipates romanticism, and there is that
Yes.
theme that he implicitly venerates nature, and he has an organicist conception going from this pre-social state through the the arrival at ultimately a total state. And I would say that the general will is, it's almost like a theological concept, in the same way that ultimate freedom lies in submitting your will to the will of God, like aligning your will with God's will is a way to attain freedom in certain Christian conceptions. Um, so I suppose something similar could be going on with the general will. It is this kind of organicist spirit of the polity, and uh, it is the the true expression, even though individuals don't see it. It is the true expression of that collective will, and it makes sense how freedom could be attained in that way. It's almost proto-fascist in a certain sense, this organicist conception of the state. In
Yeah,
which lines up with you saying he's a return to Plato in a certain sense. Of course, far less rationalist than Plato, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. There is this kind of theological element to it, but there's also the issue of Rousseau's discussion of the legislator, who, in his person, somehow is able to instantiate and channel the general will. So it's this will of the people, if they were perfectly rational and able to see the good, and yet also embodied in the person of the legislator, who himself somehow is also not, tarnished by his selfishness or his limitations in any way. I mean, it's certainly correct to see this as kind of a theological concept. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, Rousseau himself was a degenerate. He abandoned children that he had.
Five of them, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He was
And wrote
definitely.
about how important it was to educate children. Yeah. Oh, by the way, do you know the story? There was this there's this aristocratic woman, fan of Rousseau's books, who had learned that Rousseau had abandoned his children, and she wrote to him saying, "Sir, how can you do this? You who have written about the importance of educating children." And his reply is just so it's unbelievable. He'd say something like, "Madam, please, I cannot provide these children with what they need. I cannot give them writing lessons. I can't educate them properly. Let society take care of this." It is society that has generated these desires and these needs. So I also see Rousseau as one of the originators of the "society made me do it" excuse.
Mm, right. Yeah, that social institutions are the root of evil in the Rousseauian conception, and
Mm.
that is definitely carried forward into modern political discourse and people believing in basically the innate goodness of people, and these institutions create all of these disparities. It's Western political uh, institutions that lead people to experience poverty, crime. It's not that certain populations have a predisposition to crime. It's that these institutions are creating the conditions to create this injustice. But anyway, so we should probably go beyond now the keep moving past the 18th century into the 19th century. So the French Revolution happens, the American Revolution happens. Where do we go from here? What's the next step? I mean, we see anarchist thinkers begin to emerge. Obviously, Karl Marx is a big thinker towards the middle of the 19th century. Where do we go in the aftermath of a certain degree of victory for liberalism? Where do we go then? Who are the major theorists to turn to?
Well, there's a lot going on in the 19th century. As you mentioned, sort of liberalism kind of reaches its apex, at least its classical incarnation does, in the 19th century. In England, for example, you get the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. The Corn Laws are a series of laws banning and controlling the import of grain and various agricultural products. And liberals had, for at least 3 decades before then, been agitating for the repeal of these laws and the adoption of like free trade and free commerce for Britain. And they faced resistance from entrenched interests, obviously. But in 1845, England experienced a famine, and this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And so the following year, these laws were repealed. So this was, for English liberalism, kind of the heroic period. The most famous figure of 19th century English liberalism, definitely, I think, without question, is John Stuart Mill. Most people see him as this kind of prototypical liberal, really. Although I have to say, I think his reputation in this regard is almost entirely unearned and undeserved. In fact, I think he was a disaster for liberalism, and many of the ideas that he introduced eventually ended up eroding it and turning it into its modern incarnation. Now, that's controversial, but there have been a few writers in the last few decades that have started to see this kind of dark side to Mill, this totalitarian side to him that isn't necessarily evident from his published writings, but that you can determine if you read his correspondence and then go back to read his published writings in the light of that correspondence. So, okay, so let me explain. In his youth, Mill became interested in Henri de Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonian sect around France in the sort of early 19th century. And the Saint-Simonians were basically like proto-socialists. They were the forerunners of basically technocratic socialism. Saint-Simon was a very interesting guy personally, but had very, very sort of strange views. And there's a lot that Mill imbibed from him. And even though he distanced himself from the Saint-Simonians later, he never totally abandoned what he had picked up there. So first of all,
I know that Mill also was influenced by Auguste Comte, and
oh
Comte had
yes,
kind of similar project. How does Comte and positivism relate to the Saint Simonians?
oh well, Comte was also involved with the Saint-Simonians,
Oh,
in his early days as well. So the Saint-Simonianism is kind of the root of both of these things. I'll get to this in a minute. Yes, you're correct. The major things that influenced Mill are, first of all, the Saint-Simonian theory of history, which more or less goes like this. For Saint-Simon, history or eras within history are divided into what he calls natural or organic periods on the one hand, and then critical periods. So organic periods are periods of flourishing where institutions are trusted, where those who are in charge are kind of spontaneously perceived to be and understood to be the most competent and the most honorable and the most trustworthy of men. There's also a kind of unifying narrative that holds society together in those days. And basically society flourishes. It produces, the best of whatever it can produce. Great military exploits, great art, scientific discoveries, you name it, a general kind of flourishing of culture. But in the critical periods, the central orthodoxies of the culture, the kind of basic primordial ideas that everyone accepts and doesn't really think to question, begin to be questioned. And so the social fabric begins to erode. Institutions begin to collapse under the weight of criticism and so forth. And this criticism paves the way for the eventual reestablishment of a new orthodoxy, and then a new cycle begins. Now, Saint-Simon basically separated history into what you could call three periods. The first being kind of like primitive or ancient polytheism, and the second being kind of monotheism / feudalism, and then there's the third positivistic or scientific age that he saw as coming, forward on the horizon, that we were sort of on the edge of. And Auguste Comte, as I mentioned, was a follower of Saint-Simon, and even though he split from the Saint-Simonian sect for personal reasons, he more or less adopted this view wholesale and developed it in his own kind of philosophy of positivism. But instead of in previous ages where you had priests, for example, wielding sort of the dominant intellectual power and providing the cultural coherence, this function would pass over to scientists, to engineers, to technocrats, to bankers, and also just more generally to artists and intellectuals of various types. So basically, for Saint-Simon and then later Auguste Comte, they saw as coming up, in the near future, a kind of scientific age. So to sort of put this in Comtean terms, in the original, like the first stage of history, the stage of kind of primitivism and polytheism, you had these kind of animist religions, which had very simple conceptions of gods or spirits acting directly upon the world. And people, more or less believed in that. Then later, with the age of feudalism and medieval scholasticism, religion began to acquire a more abstract, more kind of intellectually sophisticated metaphysical tinge. But then further on, these metaphysical notions fell under criticism, mainly by those like the French philosophes. That worldview collapsed, and it was replaced by a kind of scientific worldview in which the way to knowledge was to, measure and predict and to formulate things in terms of natural laws and so forth and so on. Now, for Comte, he praised the French philosophes of the 18th century for having undermined traditional religion, but he believed that the work they started was incomplete because a replacement for what had been undermined had not yet been generated, and this is what Comte saw as his own kind of task: this desire to create this kind of scientific elite that would usher in the new stage of society, and that would give new coherence to things. And specifically, he wanted to establish what he called a religion of humanity. And this is, it's hard for me to call this a religion, but he certainly saw it as one. And it was basically a system in which human religious emotions and aspirations were directed at intramundane ends. That rather than serving some kind of transcendent God and directing your life and your behavior and your actions to be in accordance with that, you instead would serve the great being of humanity, the sort of human collective. That you would focus your ends in life and derive purpose from what you are doing in this world. Now, Mill, when he came across Comte, was immediately taken by this and was immediately convinced that this sort of religiosity was, as he put it in countless letters to Comte over the following few years, more truly religious or more genuinely religious than any other thing that had up to that point been called by that name. And so Comte and Mill together formed a kind of conspiracy to try and undermine Christianity and replace it with this Comtean positivistic religion of humanity. However, in England, Mill was very clear to Comte that he could not simply come out as an atheist and advocate this kind of new intramundane religion, and that he had to do so only very indirectly, because the English public was not yet ready for this. And he would write things in his letters to Comte like, one cannot at this moment in England come out and directly criticize religion, but indirectly one may strike any blow one wishes. One must discuss the subject of religion, he would say, as if religion did not exist. And this obviously lends itself to dissembling. Mill saw that he needed to hide his true views, to lie about what he truly believed. And you can see this in almost all of his published writings, but let's focus on liberty. That essay is seen as a very passionate plea for freedom of discussion, and for the idea that people should be allowed to, air grievances, and not only that, but also that they should be allowed to, well, as you put it, live degenerate lifestyles. He was in favor of experiments in living, as he put it. And this plea for toleration and free discussion was basically a tactic to enable Mill and those like him to undermine Christianity. This was something instrumental. And by the way, this is another thing that Mill picked up from Saint-Simon and from positivism, which is that as one stage of history transitions into another, the transition is accompanied by, whatever institutions happen to be characteristic of that particular stage of society. And since all of this is historically contingent, Mill came to see religious doctrines, philosophical doctrines, social institutions, and so forth as being historically provisional and historically contingent. And so he would look at something like the institution of private property or a policy like free trade and say, well, this is historically contingent. This was useful at one time, but as we enter the new positivistic age, we no longer need this, and this can be done away with. But again, as I say, you can't really see this from reading Mill's published writings. You have to read his correspondence, particularly his correspondence with Comte, with his friend Alexander Bain, with his wife Harriet Taylor Mill. And by the way, there's an interesting story with them that also goes a long way to explaining Mill's desire to advocate degenerate lifestyles. Mill himself, had a problem in life. His problem was that he fell in love with a married woman, and in Victorian England, you couldn't really do anything about that. And so he and Harriet Taylor had this very kind of bizarre relationship where they sort of orbited around each other, and there were rumors that that they were having an affair, but no definite proof. And this caused scandal. Of course, Mill and Harriet Taylor both were extremely concerned to safeguard their reputation, and so had to engage in all kinds of secrecy and dissimulation, and basically did this for years until finally Harriet Taylor's husband died. And then 2 years after that, they finally married, and they couldn't marry immediately because people would ask questions about that as well. So Mill had this kind of personal problem, this kind of personal animus that was also motivating him. And it's sort of interesting to think, well, imagine if Mill had been French, 19th century Frenchman. Okay, you have an affair with a married woman. It's like, in France, no big deal. Half the men in France have done that, But Victorian England was a very different sort of society. And this explains also why Mill On Liberty and in many other of his published writings fulminates so strongly against received opinion and received custom and majority opinion and the general kind of social mores of society, to the point that he comes to see social pressure and ostracism and shaming and all of these other kind of organic social controls as being more dangerous to liberty and more threatening towards it than the state. Mill's ultimate view actually comes to be that that as representative democracies begin to replace monarchical systems, the people will come to integrate themselves into the state and identify themselves with their rulers. And so the danger of oppression from the state, according to him, diminishes and is no longer a serious problem. And what those who believe in human freedom should really focus on are these kind of social pressures. And so under Mill's influence, which is enormous and virtually impossible to understate, liberalism is transformed from a concern with direct violence and coercion enacted upon the social body by the state to this kind of war against social institutions and social mores. That if you're a liberal now, according to Mill, you basically have to wage war on every social tradition. You must wage war on Christianity. You must wage war on every traditional value. And so liberalism becomes this very corrosive thing, which before Mill, it wasn't uniformly so. I mean, you certainly had criticisms of religion and kind of virulent anti-clericalism coming from the 18th century French thinkers. But 19th century French thinkers, who were roughly contemporaneous with Mill, did not have this attitude at all. The problem is scholars these days don't know anything other than their own language, and thanks to the dominance of the Anglosphere, no one reads anything that isn't written in English, and so no one is really aware, or very few people are aware, that there's this whole alternative tradition in France, this alternative liberal tradition, which was not hostile to tradition, which was not hostile to religion, which saw it as really a bulwark against the state, also existed roughly contemporaneous to the Millian view that, we should basically wage war on every social institution. And so liberalism came to be associated with that Millian view. It came to be seen as this kind of corrosive thing, that if you were a liberal, you had to destroy all social order, that you had to tolerate and even encourage, bizarre lifestyles and so forth. And not only that, in addition to that general thing, Mill, when he wrote about political economy, made all sorts of exceptions to the free trade position. He also, and this was very portentous, denied the general liberal view of the ultimate long-run harmony of the economic interests of all classes. He also expressed a favorable attitude toward the view that if a country was oppressing its people, it was the duty of another country to militarily intervene in the affairs of the first country to set those people free, an argument that has been beloved by neoconservatives ever since. And so he sort of, in that way, undermined the more traditional liberal position of non-interventionism in foreign affairs. So, I mean, Mill's general influence on liberalism has been horrendous, but as I say, you can't really determine this kind of stuff, especially his desire to undermine Christianity and to use freedom of speech as a pretext for that end from his published writings. You have to read his correspondence to determine that. So my basic verdict on Mill is the man is a liar. He's a snake. He should not be trusted. And yeah, he basically lied about his views. Yeah, to sort of gain influence and to shift society in the direction that he wanted to go. And in the process, he undermined liberalism.
Well, okay. So there's two things on Mill. One, he was professionally a government bureaucrat, was he not?
Yes. Yeah.
Remember which office did he work? Was it a colonial office or?
It was some colonial office for the East India Company. I can't.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Which it was a position he inherited from his father. So one thing that you didn't mention was the influence of Bentham. Was Jeremy Bentham as I know that Bentham was influential for obviously his utilitarianism on Mill. So Mill's ethical conceptions were influenced by Bentham. Also, the general epistemic position that Bentham took, Mill took to an extreme. Mill was kind of the ultimate inductivist. He even reduced logic to induction. That's a work that I wanted to read at one point. I haven't gotten to it yet.
Yes, a system of logic. And in fact, as Mill was writing that work, he was writing letters to Comte saying that this epistemological position that he was going to stake out would help to clear the ground for the eventual emergence of the positivist point of view in England. So this work on epistemology and then his utilitarianism all fitted into his general aim of undermining Christianity. Utilitarianism he counterposed to what he called the more metaphysical theories of natural rights and so forth. And yeah, and this kind of inductivist epistemology was also part of his crusade against traditional metaphysics and traditional theology. But this is all done with the political and social aim of undermining Christianity and replacing it with scientistic positivism.
Right. Now there's another way in which his epistemology is connected to his anti-liberalism or his pro social liberty, which is basically the argument that I sympathize the most with, that Mill makes, which is that we fundamentally don't know, because of his inductivist epistemology, we don't really know what the best way to live is, right? We have these traditions, these conventions that we've gotten along with, but experimentation in the spirit of the science of his times is the only way to really discover the good, right? We can have this kind of meta framework for ethics of utilitarianism, and like we can accept that there is such a thing as positive value. Different people experience it, and so we want a situation that sums to the greatest util count somehow, although the calculation there is something that's always debated among utilitarian moral theorists. But the argument that Mill gives for his social libertarianism is essentially that, well, we don't really know how the best way to live is, and so we have to set up these different social experiments and then see what wins. Now that's a kind of market-based approach that I can respect to a degree, although I disagree with Mill that we don't know what is good for humanity. I mean, from my own position, my own philosophical priors, I think there is good reason to support traditional morals, and moreover, I think that from from a kind of metaphysical anthropology, we can actually identify the ultimate good of man and then orient our social structures in some measure around that ultimate good. But I'm also a kind of epistemological pragmatist, which is similar to Mill's position, though not identical, in that, like, I could be wrong about my philosophical priors, and maybe it would be good if we allowed some degree of social experimentation for the reason that Mill gives. I mean, it's an argument that I can't get around entirely myself. The same would hold for economic policy. The same would apply for legal systems. You don't really know until you try it, and so therefore, we have to do this kind of social engineering and create a bunch of experimental contexts and see what happens. And it's definitely a philosophy that has fared well for the elites, maybe not for the rest of us, but it's remained influential. What do you make of that argument specifically, the kind of argument for social liberalism by agnosticism, right?
Well, there's two things there. You can take Mill's published writings in isolation and sort of examine them on their merits. But if you want to understand Mill, and in particular, if you want to understand what he was really saying when he made that argument, you have to understand that the argument that you just gave, Mill was not making that in good faith. He was very clear, and you see this from his correspondence written at the time as he was writing these works. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not speculating on this. He says so directly. This is not an extrapolation. This is not a guess. He admits to it. He very clearly says that he's not making these arguments for experimentation in good faith. Experimentation in social living and in the trying out of various doctrines or viewpoints, whether that be in political economy or in epistemology or in religion or anything at all. This is only useful to him in so far as it enables him to openly air his criticisms of Christianity and to erode Christianity and undermine it. Now, he's also very clear that once Christianity is undermined and the time becomes ripe to usher in the new positivist age and create the religion of humanity that will be the glue that holds this new society together, you will not be allowed to question the priors or the fundamental assumptions of that viewpoint. The scientific, technical, intellectual elite that will comprise the equivalent of the priest class of that time will not be questioned. I mean, Mill kind of weasels around this and sort of says, well, the scientific propositions that these people establish are going to be like so obviously true that, why would you question them? And he says, well, science converges on truth. And so the more science develops and the more it discovers, the less there is to argue about. I think that's extremely naive, but still, as an understanding of Mill, you have to realize that he's not making that argument in good faith. He does not really mean what he says.
So he predicts the future society where you trust the science, where you get your experimental gene therapy because, the Ministry of Health says so.
Right, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, so much for Mill then. So there are alternatives in the liberal tradition to look to. You've mentioned a couple times building up to this set of French theorists from the 19th century. So who are the characters here? What are their lasting influences? Are they read today in France? Are you aware of any continued legacy for them?
Well, before I answer the latter question, I should get into some of the names. The most significant person, probably, the person that, if you ask me, should have the reputation in the history of liberalism that Mill currently does have, is Benjamin Constant. Now, Constant's also kind of an interesting guy in his own right. An amusing story about his youth. He when he was a boy, he was tutor. He had a tutor, and the tutor, in order to entertain him, as teachers sometimes do for small children and get them interested in the material, he proposed the idea of the two of them speaking a secret language to one another. to kind of enthrall him. But the secret language turned out to be classical Greek, and he learned he learned classical Greek that way. But anyway, Constant was basically everything that people typically say Mill was. He actually was. Some of his kind of more characteristic views are basically as follows. He was strongly in favor of constitutional limits on the state, and specifically, he was in favor of crafting constitutions in such a way that they pitted various organs of the state against one another, so that the interests of different parts of the state were antagonistic and therefore could serve as a check on the overall growth of state power. And after the French Revolution, specifically during the July Monarchy and then during the Bourbon Restoration of Louis XVIII, he tried drafting a few constitutions to this effect. But basically, Constant really learned the proper lesson from the French Revolution. He saw the horrendous outpouring of violence that happened then. He wasn't in France at the time. He had escaped to Germany and kind of watched it from a distance. But he realized what had happened and what passions the French Revolution had unleashed, and he specifically realized the intimate connection between the French Revolution's violence and its anti-religiousness. Constant was a profoundly religious man. He was a Protestant, and he wrote, in fact, an enormous book on religion, about 1,000 pages long, kind of an anthropological study of religion, was tremendously interested in it, and eventually came to the view that religion was tremendously important, especially in the modern age. The modern age being the age of this growing, massive, bureaucratic, hypertrophied state. Religion was important because it provided an intermediary to kind of shield the individual from the depredations of the state, something that stands between the individual and the state. He was also, for the same reason, in favor of all kinds of regionalism. There were all sorts of regional groups in France, the Gascons, some Basques, and so forth, that were sort of brought together and homogenized as the French state began to centralize. And he was very much in favor of granting regional autonomy to these people, again, as a means of checking hypertrophied state power. So this is one aspect of his thought. Again, he was not, as said, he was not hostile to religion at all. He viewed it as essential to freedom. He thought that if a people was not religious and was not willing to, devote itself to God, that the state would eventually come in and take over the function that God was supposed to perform in people's lives, and so would just rise to this total, unlimited, and unchecked extent. There's also a very important essay of Constant's in which he compares the ancient conception of liberty to the modern conception, and this had pretty significant influence on a lot of subsequent French thinkers. Basically, for the ancients, liberty was seen as the ability to participate in the state and to effectuate your political desires, to have a role in crafting policy. And so therefore, in ancient Athens, even the most insignificant citizen had some noticeable degree of power. On the other hand, in the democracies of his time, this really couldn't be brought to bear because, number one, the societies were enormously larger. Secondly, people were pushing for universal suffrage and in some cases had achieved it. And so when you have such an enormous voting population, the political influence of individual citizens becomes virtually nothing. So the proper conception of liberty for the modern world, he thought, was to basically have people be free of state action, to be as uninterfered with by the state as possible. And if you attempted to graft the ancient conception of liberty onto contemporary political institutions, you would get terrors like the French Revolution. And that was basically his interpretation of what went wrong with the French Revolution. And so from this, Constant drew a number of conclusions. For one thing, he was not in favor of universal suffrage. He said that only those with property should be allowed to vote. And he was quite shrewd in understanding, virtually before anyone else, he wrote in the early 19th century, that if you granted universal suffrage, people would start voting wars in which they would attempt to, vote resources away from one another by using the state. And this would, of course, be conducive to a growth of the state and turn the rest of society into a kind of low intensity civil war. So Constant, a very important thinker in early 19th century France. And as I said, he basically learned the correct lessons from the French Revolution and modified liberalism accordingly. And in France, he had tremendous influence on a number of people. In the post-revolutionary period, the kind of Restoration era, so the 1810s and 1820s, French thinkers became very interested in history, and they became interested in it mainly so that they could understand what went wrong with the French Revolution, because here were all these liberals, and they were ecstatic about the possibility of, overthrowing monarchy, of undoing the mercantilist system, of eliminating all these restrictions. And instead of ushering in this golden age of freedom, everything turned into a bloodbath. So they began to wonder what went wrong. And from this kind of brew emerged a great deal of different historical theories, different interpretations of history. Constance was one of them, but this ended up developing much further. In particular, it reached a high point in the work of two writers named Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer. Charles Comte, not to be confused with Auguste Comte. Comte and Dunoyer were the founders of a periodical called Le Censeur, whose first issue was published in, June 12th, 1814. That's right. And basically, in the first incarnation of that publication, which lasted from June of 1814 to September of 1815, when they were finally shut down by the authorities, they had more or less a kind of standard liberal take. They were in favor of, basic kind of liberal freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, the sorts of things that were enunciated in the liberal charter that was drawn up by Benjamin Constant for Louis XVIII's Restoration government. But they saw that the government at the time was not holding to these things, was not adhering to the charter, and so they published these criticisms of them. Eventually, they ran afoul of the authorities, and as I said, were shut down. And they sort of retreated for a period of about a year and a half. But during this period, Comte and Dunoyer read Constant. They also read the economist Jean-Baptiste Say, who's also very interesting and an important thinker in this French tradition, who I'll discuss in a second. And then they read a reactionary French historian named François Montlancier. And this person was quite interesting to them. Virtually no one remembers him now, of course, but he had an influence on them because he saw the French Revolution as the triumph of a kind of emerging mercantile, capitalist, kind of bourgeois class. And he saw the eventual lead up to the French Revolution as, the product of this kind of mutual class antagonism between the king and the aristocrats on the one hand, and the bourgeoisie and the merchant class on the other. So he gave to Comte and Dunoyer this idea of a class-based interpretation of history, and specifically an economic interpretation of history. So there was Constant and his conception of the difference between modern and ancient liberty. There was Montlancier and his class-based kind of economic take. And then there was Jean-Baptiste Say's treatise on political economy, originally published in 1803, but went through a number of editions and was greatly expanded throughout those editions. And Say presented himself as a follower of Adam Smith, although he really was not. He was much more in the tradition of Richard Cantillon and Turgot, some of the earlier French economists that I mentioned, but he did not emphasize this about himself and instead presented himself as a Smithian, because the physiocrats, and Turgot was seen wrongly as a physiocrat, were associated with royalism and in the sort of post-French Revolution atmosphere, you were not going to get a hearing for your ideas if people came to associate those sorts of things with you. So, but as I say, even though he presented himself as a Smithian, he had profound theoretical differences with Smith. For example, if you read the Wealth of Nations, there's really no pretense to any design. It's a congeries of different ideas. I mean, Smith kind of just like throws stuff together at the wall to see what sticks. I mean, book one of The Wealth of Nations, for example, and its discussion of division of labor completely contradicts everything that he says in book 5 about the division of labor. In book 1, he gives this kind of standard free market position of, differential talents between people and the division of labor emerging because people realize that specialization produces, great benefits to productivity and so forth, kind of a standard analysis. But then in book 5, he says that over-specialization leads to boring jobs, which then leads to unfulfilling work, which then creates alienation, and this is something that the Marxist would later seize upon. But for Say, his view was, instead of labor theory of value that Smith adopted, he was a subjective value theorist. He was also important in that he stressed the role of the entrepreneur in economic coordination. In fact, he introduced the word entrepreneur, a French word, into the lexicon of economics. Adam Smith, although he was aware of entrepreneurs, by the way, the word entrepreneur was not used by Smith. He called them undertakers. He described these entrepreneurs, undertakers, as basically just performing a kind of administrative function. They were just sort of, bureaucrats that really didn't do much. They just sort of oversaw the business and the concern, and that was it. They were kind of administrators. This is something that was seized upon by Lenin and by other socialists as fodder for their theories about the alleged exploitativeness of the capitalist class. But for Say, and this is probably had something to do with the fact that Say himself was an entrepreneur. He was a cotton manufacturer. He realized that the entrepreneur performed a vital task in economic coordination, that he undertook risk, that he attempted to, channel resources to various places and sort of coordinate things by making predictions, by trying to anticipate demand, and all this kind of standard, pre-Austrian analysis. Another major difference between Say and Smith was that for Adam Smith, only material goods were productive. So sort of like immaterial services, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals, that sort of thing. He didn't see that as contributing to productivity. Whereas for Say, since he took a subjective theory of value, he said, well, such people were productive. Lawyers, doctors, etc., all did, make their contribution to the economy and to society. And then, as a final thing, in later editions of Say's treatise, he opened up a discussion of how merchants and various capitalists had begun appealing to the state to try and get taxes and other economic restrictions implemented for their benefit. And he began to distinguish between, free market capitalists who just, produced value and operated free market firms, and these kind of state capitalists who sought to restrict commerce and then thereby to essentially, exploit the populace. So Comte and Dunoyer, in the second incarnation of their periodical, which is called Le Censeur Européen, they sort of returned in February of 1817, and having read these other writers that I mentioned, they evolved from just kind of standard liberal critics of the regime to having a very kind of sophisticated historical class-based economic analysis of the state and of society in general. And they basically divided society into two antagonistic classes. There were those who benefited from state activity, meaning, the king, the aristocracy, the merchants who were connected with the state and had various economic restrictions enacted on their behalf, and basically anyone else connected with the state who in any way earned their living from taxation. And then on the other hand, everyone else, people who were sort of producing value in the marketplace voluntarily. And they began very sharply to distinguish between the state and between society in general. Most theorists had, before them, really, to one degree or another, seen the state as a kind of natural emergence of society, even a kind of apotheosis of society, this grand, indicator of social development, a sign that a society was truly advanced and mature, a sort of like a generally positive view of the state, even if certain liberals were kind of critical of the state's excesses. But for Comte and Dunoyer, this was not the case at all, and they had quite vituperative rhetoric in which they expressed their views. They basically saw the government classes as exploitative. They would say things like society is divided into worker bees and hornets. So there are people who live by free exchange and voluntary interaction on the market, and then there are those who live by plunder. Dunoyer, in particular, I can remember, wrote an article where he was talking about the military establishment in France around the Napoleonic period. This is around Napoleon's return and in that whole general milieu. And he said something like, what have all these armies produced? Nothing but rapes, massacres, plunderings, rapines, et cetera, and went on like that. So basically for Comte and Dunoyer, there was the state, and then there was the rest of society, the voluntary market upon which the state was parasitic. And these two classes, because of their conflicting economic interests, were in opposition to one another. Furthermore, and this was specifically developed by Dunoyer, he took this class analysis and developed a theory of history out of it. And this theory of history basically had 6 stages. This was expressed in a book he published later in 1826 after the Century Liberalism was shut down by the authorities. And there's a whole interesting saga about that and all the court cases and various fights that they had with the authorities to prevent them from being shut down. But eventually they were. And since Comte and Dunoyer were no longer involved in the kind of general battle of day-to-day politics after their periodical had been shut down, they were able to sort of retire and engage in more mature reflection on the subjects they've been writing about. And one of the products of that was Dunoyer's book. The French title is L'Industrie et la Morale, Industry and Morals. And by morals, he didn't mean, what we think of as morals, but just kind of general culture. He used the word morals in a kind of archaic way. And he broke up history into 6 stages and also said that the economic basis of each stage of history tended to have associated with it a certain kind of culture, a certain set of moral values, and so forth and so on. So the stages were basically this. The first stage was primitive savagery. And in this stage, there was no kind of general production for the future. You kind of took whatever was there in nature. You had like a hunter-gatherer society. And basically, according to Dunoyer, most of the really boring kind of legwork was done by women, and women were sort of corralled into this work. And it was a generally kind of miserable existence. But, for those who did engage in productive labor, which in those days, as he saw it, was women. Again, I'm describing his view. I'm not saying that I agree with it totally. But he said, well, even though this is pretty horrible, those engaged in peaceful commerce and peaceful production were beginning to develop, commercial values and kind of presaged later stages of history. After that came the stage of kind of like nomadism and pastoralism. So in this stage of history, you had people have, flocks of animals around them, and therefore it was seen more that, people could acquire a certain amount of resources. Of course, conditions at this stage were extremely precarious because most production and most wealth was reaped by conquest and war. And so you had an enormous amount of raids being conducted on one another all the time. And even though things were more productive in this stage than they were under primitive savagery, this increased productivity had a dark side in that it exposed people to the Malthusian trap. So productivity would increase, and then people would breed up to the limit of whatever the productive resources of the time would support. And when they bumped up against those limits, you would have mass die-offs. And of course, to acquire more resources and to prevent these die-offs, you would need to engage in war. And so societies became extremely warlike and violent. Then, Dunoyer said, agriculture was discovered. And with agriculture, it became possible to produce surpluses of food. But in order to generate those surpluses, you needed an enormous labor force. And that labor force came from slave labor. And so, and kind of ironically, he views slavery as a sort of civilizing institution, because prior to agriculture, when large numbers of slaves were not necessary, if you defeated a group of people in war, you simply massacred them. Whereas now you at least kept them alive and used them as slaves. So to that small extent, it performed kind of a civilizing function. And he ends up discussing, all sorts of ancient societies, particularly ancient Greece and Rome, and how their economies were and societies were structured around warfare, around the, large military garrisons and so on. From this, he eventually moves on to feudalism, and says that because of labor shortages and scarcity of labor, landowners, those who would normally have enslaved workers to work on their fields, became incentivized to treat people more humanely, and so slavery evolved into a kind of serfdom, and then serfs began to secure for themselves certain minimal rights. Dunoyer, and this is an area where I just totally part company with him, was insistent that Christianity and its kind of the diffusion of its values throughout society had no effect on this general, kind of slackening and this kind of drift toward a more humanitarian treatment of laborers. He insisted that the reason for this transition was purely economic. But around the feudal system, you had emerged a network of guilds and eventually state restrictions on commerce, the mercantilist system that we discussed. And so with the rise of this mercantilist system, you then had, again, emerged this kind of antagonistic class warfare between not only aristocrats and the king, but also certain classes of merchants who had secured state privileges as against those who had not. And he saw this as sort of out of this brew, the first stirrings of the commercial, or what he would call the industrial morality, came to emerge. Industrialism was kind of Dunoyer's term for peaceful commerce. So this stage of history, where you had these kind of mercantilistic restrictions with this jockeying for privilege and jockeying for state power to secure monopoly grants, to, that whole network, et cetera, that came to an end, he said, with the French Revolution. But under the mercantilist/feudalist system, most state privileges were a result of birth. They were a result of your position. And even though after the French Revolution, people had the opportunity to abolish the system altogether and usher in an era of free commerce, they chose not to do this, and instead decided to completely democratize access to all government positions. And so this ended up being his interpretation of why the French Revolution went wrong. Basically, he said that it devolved into a scramble for loot and for government jobs, which, especially in the post-revolutionary period, in the Restoration, under the Bourbons, the brief period that Napoleon returned, and then later in the July monarchy of Louis Philippe, that is basically what it was. It was just a jockeying for government jobs. And he began analyzing this process of jockeying for government jobs. Basically says, as you democratize access to government positions, the state grows enormously. It acquires this gargantuan bureaucracy. And as the bureaucracy proliferates, you have to give the bureaucrats something to do, which then necessarily increases the size of the state, and the state begins to, stick its tentacles into everything. But this is basically how he framed history, as this antagonistic war between those who lived by peaceful commerce and exchange on the one hand, and those who lived by plunder and violence on the other. And eventually he said that, at some point in the future, the advantages of peaceful commerce, the fact that the market is able in the long run to ultimately harmonize all economic interests, this will prove so advantageous eventually, and the hypertrophying state will prove so damaging and destructive that eventually it will collapse under its own weight. and usher in this era of peaceful commerce. And it's not totally clear whether Dunoyer was a full-blown anarcho-capitalist or whether he advocated a kind of ultra-minimal state. But there are certain passages in his work where he does seem to speak that way, even though he doesn't consistently talk that way. So the interesting thing that I want to sort of add on to the end of this is this whole notion of history as a contest between competing economic classes, which passes through various stages and whose culture and mores are determined by the underlying economic base, and which eventually, culminates in the end of class struggle. If this all sounds vaguely kind of Marxist, that's because Marx stole his theory of history from these writers that I've been talking about. And Marx, to his credit, admitted this. He said that the discovery of the class interpretation of history and of economic analysis and economics and economic interest as a driver of historical advance, that this was not original with him. He had picked this up from bourgeois historians, as he put it. And he was referring to people like Comte de Dunoyer and also a few others like Augustin Thierry and Francois Guizot, who had more or less similar views. So Marx admitted that this wasn't original with him, but his followers forgot this, and it came to be seen that this class-based interpretation of history was a feature of Marxism, whereas it's really something that Marx picked up from earlier classical liberal/libertarian writers. And this is not something widely known because Comte de Dunoyer's work has not been translated. There's a very small amount of secondary sources written about them in English, and I've basically read all of them because there's so little that one person could read everything. But their work remains in France. It remains untranslated. And even as far as I know, even most French writers and historians of political thought don't really pay them all that much attention, which is unfortunate because this is something very interesting, if you ask me.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't know anything about those authors. Did they have any influence on the Austrian school? Did Menger read Dunoyer?
I don't know. I mean, I do know that they had influence on Italian thinkers, the Italian elitists, Pareto, Francesco Ferrara, and these other sort of Italian economists in the late 18th and early 20th century were absolutely influenced by them. Pareto's kind of elite theory, his view of the state as being this giant center for the distribution of spoils, as being a kind of center of power and economic exploitation. That was all lifted completely from them, and from Gustave de Molinari, who was a friend of Dunoyer's and later a follower of his. So they definitely had influence on Italian economists.
Okay, great. I'm thinking now that we will probably not be able to get up to the current day in this talk. Probably we will terminate just before discussion of the Austrian school. So for the rest of the 19th century, these French thinkers have some limited impact. Mill is influential. What are the other major figures you would point to? Obviously, Karl Marx. The other major figures you would point to in the 19th century, and then maybe we could come up with some kind of basic scheme of development and divergence of different branches. Liberalism speciates into libertarianism, anarchism. In a way, it turns into communism. There's another strain of liberalism that was really crypto-socialism, like Mill, you're saying, was a crypto-socialist. And then, there's the other tradition that develops into neoliberalism. How can we, maybe with the rest of our time, we'll wrap up right around 2 hours, we can kind of map out how this branching begins to take place through the 19th century.
Okay, well, the one branch which is I would regard as sort of the branch that's most faithful to liberalism's origins, which is kind of a libertarian branch, that basically starts off by influencing these Italian economists like Antonio Di Viti De Marco, Pareto, who's often described as a fascist, although he wasn't. He described Gustave de Molinari, widely considered the first anarcho-capitalist. He often referred to him as maître, master. So Pareto was actually an ANCAP, but an extremely pessimistic one who believed that, because people were kind of hopelessly irrational, that they would never be, convinced to adopt that policy. And especially given the fact that he lived in the early 20th century and saw the rise of, socialism, communism, fascism. He basically more or less came to the view that the world was going to hell and there was nothing to be done about it. But these French thinkers did have an influence on the libertarian strain of thought by influencing the Italian economists. Then later the Austrians came, and the Austrians they emerged mainly because of the rediscovery of earlier French thinkers like Turgot and like Say, and their work on subjective value theory, which had been submerged because of the influence of Adam Smith and Mill on political economy. So there was that one path. The other was the sort of crypto-socialist path that you mentioned, with Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte and Mill. And the Saint-Simonians, of course, had their own theory of history, and they sort of argued with the likes of Dunoyer and Guizot about that. So that sort of emerged out of that brew. And the Saint-Simonians had their own take on the economic interpretation of history. So you had this kind of socialist branch as well. And you could probably also, look at a few later thinkers in the 19th century who were influenced by Mill, like L.T. Hobhouse at the very end of the 19th century, who pretty famously said, well, there was an old liberalism which focused on keeping the individual free from coercion by the state. But now there's a new liberalism in which all the resources of society are kind of marshaled together to assist the individual in his self-development. So that became this kind of turn towards socialism. Another influence in the socialist branch was Edward Bernstein and so-called revisionist Marxism. Basically, by about 1900, it became abundantly clear that Marx's predictions about the progressive immiseration of the proletariat were not coming true. The working classes were not getting poorer; they were, in fact, getting wealthier. And this was a problem for Marxists, and they needed to explain it. And in order to explain it, here comes Edward Bernstein, who basically says, well, instead of this kind of revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system, we should instead adopt what later came to be called this kind of gradual Fabian path of, establishing a welfare state and kind of, steadily growing the state until eventually, bit by bit, rather than through some, fiery revolution, we can establish a state gradually in that way. So that became the socialist branch. Then there was also kind of the anarchists who were emerging. People like Proudhon and Kropotkin, who did not have liberal economic views at all, but had a very kind of radical critique of the state as this kind of center of exploitation, which you could sort of trace to the writings of Comte and Dunoyer. Although the view of anarchists, and by extension also of Marxists, and remember Marx picked up this theory of history from Comte and Dunoyer, they had it that it wasn't the state per se that was the ultimate organ of exploitation. It was private property owners who had set up the state as a tool to safeguard their property interests. And so the state wasn't itself an engine of exploitation. It was a device used by the ultimate exploiters, namely the capitalist class. So there was that kind of reworking there that sort of influenced the socialist branch. And you had basically all of these divergences. In England in particular, the socialist branch wanted to rebrand itself as liberal because the word liberal had attained a great deal of purchase among English-speaking people, and the word socialism was excoriated. It's still excoriated in the Anglosphere. People still don't like that word, even if they agree with most of the policies without even realizing that they do. But democratic socialists of the Bernstein, Hobhouse ilk began to rebrand themselves as we move into the 20th century, and they began calling themselves liberals. And the older liberals, the sort of libertarian-esque people, began to say, okay, well, what do we do now? They've stolen our word. How do we refer to ourselves? And then they began to refer to themselves as individualists. This is something that Aubrand Herbert did, Aubrand Herbert was a follower of Herbert Spencer, and Herbert Spencer was an approximate contemporary of Mills. He was a generation younger, but as far as classical liberalism goes, he was far more consistent in that vein than Mill was. He's someone else we can mention, and I probably would mention if we had time, but yeah, that's another divergence. So you have these anarchists with their radical critique of the state, but kind of socialist economics, the socialist branch, and then the continuance of the liberal tradition through the Italian economists, and then eventually into the Austrian school with the rediscovery of earlier French thought and earlier Spanish scholastic economic thought. So those are basically the currents that flowed out of that. And yeah, from there we enter the 20th century.
Right. Well, let's hit Herbert Spencer now, just quickly before we wrap up. I think he would fit better in this discussion than the next one.
Okay. He was basically a Lockean. He had although with a very strong kind of utilitarian tinge to him. The kind of centerpiece of his philosophy was what he called the law of equal freedom, which is basically the idea that each person should have the right to do as he likes within his sphere of action, provided that he not infringe on the equal liberty of others. From this, he derived property rights and a very limited role for the state, extremely limited. He was totally against all foreign intervention. In fact, the last article that he wrote just before his death in 1903 involved him, fulminating against the Boer War. Yeah, so a total removal of all kind of economic restrictions on commerce. He was also, interestingly, in favor of totally privatizing education. He thought the state should have no role in education whatsoever, primarily because if the state did have a role in education, that it would inculcate pro-statist attitudes in children, which would undermine the classical liberal, program. And so that was basically more or less the view that he expressed in his youth. He even had a chapter in his main book, Social Statics, published in, 1851 or 1851. And this chapter was called The Right to Ignore the State. And it was later reprinted by anarchists in pamphlet form, because basically what he ended up saying was, if you were a man engaged in peaceful commerce and respected the rights of others, you had the right, if you so desired, to ignore the state and not subscribe to its legal or protective services, and basically not even pay taxes. Herbert Spencer ended up walking back from this position as he got older, and he ended up removing that chapter from subsequent editions of his book. But the editions that are published now do include it. And as I said, anarchists took to it very, very well. And then his more radical followers like Aubrand Herbert were outright anarchists. Although I should also say, as Spencer got older and as you moved into the later 19th century, the socialist branch of liberalism began to sort of grow dominant. And so liberal kind of sounding phrases were being used to expand the power of the state. Not only that, but you had socialist movements rising up. The revolutions of 1848 only got worse as things went on. And so Herbert Spencer began getting more and more right-wing as he got older, and eventually started advocating that the state repress these socialist crazies who were, threatening to destroy civilization. So I think it would be an exaggeration to call him a fascist, but he certainly went from a kind of extreme libertarian position to a much more, much more right-wing, authoritarian kind of viewpoint after he saw the damage that socialism could wreak, both socially and economically. This is even true of Dunoyer. I think the last book he ever published was a book called On the Revolution of February 28th, in which he described the 1848 revolutions and was just like, oh my God, civilization is collapsing. We have to do something to keep these lunatics from attaining power, because they're going to destroy the entire accumulated capital and savings of civilization, and we might revert to barbarism as a result of this. So even Dunoyer began saying, okay, well, maybe the state should repress these people for the good of civilization. I think that's an interesting development because, of course, today we also have a kind of similar movement where a lot of formerly libertarian and libertarian sympathetic people, seeing what what the left has done and is doing, are shifting toward a more radical and more authoritarian right-wing outlook. And it's just interesting to see that this has happened before, and that what we're seeing now is an instance of history repeating itself.
Right. Well, just like the NAP covers self-defense, or self-defense is an exception, I think collective self-defense against SJWs is appropriate. But that's just my opinion. So the last question I have is, what did the church have to say about all of this? Were there any ecclesiastical thinkers that had like a notable counterpoint to these developments in liberalism?
Well, it depends. I mean, there were differences. There were Catholic liberals. I mean, for example, Lord Acton, probably the most famous of them. And Lord Acton was the first really to emphasize the role of the Middle Ages and the medieval church and the eventual, establishment of rights theories and the eventual emergence of liberalism, which we talked about last time. This is something that, yeah, as far as I know, Acton was basically the first to talk about. Among the French 19th century liberals, you also had the Comte de Montalembert, a very prominent French liberal, uh, totally free market, in favor of completely privatizing education, mainly on the grounds that he feared that children would be inculcated with kind of atheistic values or with values that were, conducive to the expansion of the state. So you did have sort of very deeply religious, pro-liberal, classical liberal thinkers. I mentioned Constant as well. Now, as far as the other side of it, of course, in reaction to the French Revolution, you had people like Bonal or de Maistre, who basically just said that, that the bloodbath of the French Revolution is what you naturally get when you unleash human passions. That, if you set people free, their sinful fallen nature takes over and you get the insanity that you got during the French Revolution. And so, as you know, if you've read de Maistre, he basically viewed the French Revolution and the terror as divine chastisement for what the people had done for their kind of movement away from God. And the view of de Maistre and Bonald and these other kind of post-revolution theocrats was basically that man is fallen, man is barely removed from a savage, and his violent instincts must be repressed by a powerful state with divine sanction. And now the interesting thing too is Constant was a contemporary of de Maistre, and he ended up arguing with both sides, with the more extreme kind of anti-clerical liberals. He argued that no, religion is important as a bulwark against the state, and then also argued with the kind of de Maistre faction, saying that, well, it's certainly true that man is fallen, but what about the agents of the state? Did the effects of the fall just pass them by somehow? So that's kind of an interesting development there, and it may explain also why the Constant strain of kind of pro-religious liberalism has sort of not been as well remembered, probably because he was kind of swallowed up by these two opposing sides, the more extreme liberals and the more extreme kind of right-wing reaction to it. But as I say, most of this stuff is written in French, and I can't read French, so I don't have access to most of this literature. I've only read the little that's been published in English, so there's a lot I don't know.
Well, it's interesting anyway that the church had thinkers on both sides of this. I mean, towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it seems like the church institutionally takes a side on, towards conservatism, authoritarianism. But then after World War II, it takes a hard left turn and is continuing in that direction. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the influence of the church in the 20th century developments in liberalism as well, still relevant. So it was lucid and edifying as always, Ivan. Looking forward to the next installment where we'll basically just discuss 20th century liberalism, and I still also would like to maybe get into some kind of uh, I don't want to call it debate, but a discussion about the basic tenets of libertarianism, anarchism with you, because we do still have different opinions. But as always, it was a pleasure. So thank you guys for listening. Any final words? And do you think we'll be coming out with another installment next week, in a couple weeks?
Next week should work. I mean, if something happens, I'll let you know. But as of right now, no, next week is definitely doable. I look forward to it. Thank you for having me on. And I should apologize because I did want to try and fit everything into this installment, but of course couldn't because I wanted to talk a lot about not only Mill but Comte and Dunwoye, especially since they're virtually unknown, and that took up a lot of time. But hopefully it was people found it worthwhile and interesting, so they're kind of compensated for it in that way.
I think so. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you, Ivan, and thank you guys for listening. Take care.